The most dangerous choice is never between two people. It is between power and conscience. The crystal chandeliers bathed the grand ballroom in warm golden light, reflecting across polished marble floors where the city's wealthiest families stood in perfect silence. Every tailored tuxedo, every sparkling evening gown, every measured smile belonged to people accustomed to controlling the future with a single conversation. At the center of the room stood Gabriel Bennett, the White Mafia boss whose quiet authority could calm an entire boardroom without raising his voice. His tailored black suit fit his broad, athletic frame flawlessly, while the open collar of his black dress shirt revealed the unmistakable black and gray tattoos climbing across his neck and upper chest. His calm brown eyes never searched for approval. They simply observed. Across from him stood Victoria Langford, elegant and poised, beside her father, Richard Langford, one of the most influential businessmen in the state. Between them rested a velvet-covered table prepared for an engagement announcement that every guest had expected for months. Silver pens waited beside neatly arranged documents. Crystal champagne glasses sparkled beneath the lights. A string quartet continued playing softly, unaware that the evening was about to change forever. Several feet away, almost hidden among the serving staff, Naomi Brooks quietly balanced a polished silver tray. Her Black Maid uniform was immaculate despite the long hours she had already worked. She moved with graceful confidence, never drawing unnecessary attention to herself, yet somehow the room always seemed calmer wherever she walked. Her deep brown skin glowed naturally beneath the warm lights. Her gentle almond-shaped eyes remained focused on her duties, and her expression carried the quiet dignity of someone who had learned long ago that respect could not be demanded, only lived. She never imagined the next few minutes would place every eye in the ballroom upon her. Richard Langford slowly stepped forward, his polished smile hiding the firmness behind his words. He lifted a glass, thanked everyone for attending, praised the partnership between two respected families, and then allowed the silence to settle before speaking again. "There is only one matter left before we celebrate," he said evenly. "Certain rumors have become impossible to ignore." A ripple of uncomfortable whispers moved across the ballroom before disappearing almost instantly. No one interrupted him. No one dared. Richard turned his gaze toward Naomi without saying her name. That single glance was enough for every guest to understand exactly whom he meant. Victoria lowered her eyes briefly before looking back at Gabriel with restrained concern rather than anger. "You have always been respected," Richard continued. "But leadership demands clarity. The people who stand with you deserve certainty. Tonight, you must remove every doubt." Naomi remained perfectly still, unsure whether she should quietly leave the room or continue standing where she was. Her fingers tightened around the silver tray only slightly, careful not to reveal the nervousness building inside her. She had spent months avoiding attention, speaking kindly to every employee, helping anyone who needed her, and expecting nothing in return. Yet somehow she had become the center of a conversation she never wanted. Richard finally took one slow step closer to Gabriel, his voice calm enough to sound almost reasonable. "Choose one," he said. "The future standing beside you, or the maid standing behind you." Every breath inside the ballroom seemed to stop at once. The musicians lowered their bows. Crystal glasses remained untouched. Even the soft fountain beyond the open terrace suddenly felt impossibly distant. Naomi slowly lowered her eyes, already believing she knew what Gabriel's answer would be. But Gabriel did not look at the engagement documents waiting on the velvet table. He did not look at Victoria. Instead, he turned slowly toward the quiet woman holding the silver tray, and the expression on his face revealed absolutely nothing. 6 months earlier, before whispered rumors drifted through elegant hallways, and before powerful families questioned anyone's place inside the Bennett estate, Naomi Brooks arrived carrying everything she owned inside 2 modest suitcases. The morning sky was pale blue as a taxi disappeared beyond the iron entrance gates, leaving her standing before a mansion so vast it seemed almost unreal. Towering stone columns framed the entrance. Carefully trimmed gardens stretched across several acres, and the quiet fountain at the center of the circular driveway reflected the first light of day. Naomi paused only for a moment before taking a slow breath and walking toward the front doors. She had not come searching for a miracle. She had come searching for honest work. Mrs. Eleanor Hayes, the estate manager, greeted her with a professional smile and immediately began explaining the routines that kept the enormous household operating with perfect precision. There were schedules for every room, every meal, every guest, and every event. Every employee understood exactly where they belonged. Naomi listened carefully, asking few questions, taking mental notes with remarkable attention. She thanked everyone who introduced themselves, even those who barely acknowledged her greeting. By lunchtime, she already knew the names of gardeners, drivers, cooks, security officers, and housekeepers, while many of them still referred to her simply as the new maid. None of that seemed to trouble her. Respect, she believed, was something offered freely rather than requested. On that same morning, Gabriel Bennett returned from a series of meetings in downtown Chicago. His black luxury sedan rolled through the estate gates without attracting excitement among the staff, because this routine had repeated itself countless times before. He stepped from the vehicle wearing his signature black tailored suit, the open collar of his black shirt revealing familiar black and gray tattoos climbing across his neck. His posture remained relaxed, his expression calm, his movements measured. Employees greeted him respectfully as he entered the mansion. Gabriel acknowledged each greeting with a slight nod before continuing toward his office. He passed Naomi in the main hallway without slowing down. She quietly stepped aside to allow him through, lowering her eyes politely before returning to her work. Neither of them spoke. To Gabriel, she was simply another new employee joining a household that already required the efforts of dozens of dedicated people every day. To Naomi, he was simply the owner of the estate, someone whose path would likely never cross hers beyond brief moments in the hallway. The days settled into a comfortable rhythm. Naomi worked before sunrise and often finished long after sunset, yet she never complained. She carefully polished antique furniture, arranged fresh flowers, prepared guest rooms, and helped wherever another employee needed an extra pair of hands. When one elderly gardener struggled to carry heavy planting trays across the courtyard, Naomi quietly helped him without expecting thanks. When one of the younger kitchen assistants accidentally dropped an entire tray of fresh pastries, Naomi stayed late to help prepare another batch before dinner service. Small acts of kindness appeared wherever she happened to be, often unnoticed by those who benefited from them. She believed that if no one remembered her name, they might still remember how she made them feel. Meanwhile, Gabriel continued balancing business meetings, charitable events, and responsibilities that consumed nearly every hour of his schedule. He rarely noticed individual moments inside the household because he assumed everything functioned smoothly through careful management. He did not yet realize that one quiet woman, whose name he had not even learned, was slowly becoming the invisible heart of the estate. One quiet Thursday afternoon, the rhythm of the Bennett estate changed so subtly that almost no one noticed it happening. The autumn sunlight poured through the tall windows, casting long golden reflections across polished wooden floors while employees hurried to prepare for an evening charity reception. Every schedule was running behind. Deliveries had arrived late, floral arrangements were incomplete, and several kitchen staff members were struggling to finish dinner preparations before the first guests appeared. Voices remained polite, but the growing pressure could be felt in every hallway. Naomi Brooks moved calmly through the mansion without adding to the confusion. She carried fresh flowers from room to room, helped the pastry chef arrange desserts after another employee called in sick, and quietly reminded a young server that nervousness disappeared the moment kindness took its place. She never spoke loudly. She never demanded attention. Somehow, everyone around her worked a little more confidently after she left. Late that afternoon, an unexpected problem threatened to cancel the children's charity reading scheduled inside the estate library. The volunteer assigned to read stories had become stranded several counties away because of heavy traffic, and dozens of children from a nearby community center had already begun arriving with their teachers. Mrs. Eleanor Hayes looked anxiously toward the entrance, checking her watch every few seconds. She whispered to another employee that disappointing the children would reflect poorly on the estate, especially because several important donors planned to visit later that evening. Naomi quietly overheard the conversation while arranging books on a nearby table. Without hesitation, she gently asked whether she could help until the volunteer arrived. Mrs. Hayes looked surprised. Can you keep 30 children entertained for almost an hour? She asked. Naomi smiled softly. I can certainly try. Within minutes, the library transformed from a room filled with restless voices into a place of complete attention. Naomi sat beside the fireplace with an old illustrated storybook resting on her lap. She did not perform dramatically or exaggerate every page. Instead, she spoke with warmth, changing her tone gently for each character while inviting the children to imagine every scene themselves. Their laughter filled the room. Even the teachers relaxed, smiling as children who normally struggled to remain still leaned forward to hear every word. Upstairs, Gabriel Bennett finished an online meeting earlier than expected. As he crossed the second-floor hallway toward his office, the cheerful sound drifting from the library below caught his attention. Curious, he paused beside the balcony overlooking the room. He expected to see a professional entertainer leading the event. Instead, he found the quiet maid he barely remembered, sitting comfortably among the children, answering every question with patience, encouraging shy voices, and treating every child with genuine respect. She never noticed that he was watching. Gabriel remained where he was for several minutes without interrupting. There was something remarkably sincere about the scene. No photographers were present. No influential guests had arrived. No one important appeared to be observing. Yet Naomi gave the same care and kindness she would have offered if the entire world had been watching. As the final page closed, every child applauded enthusiastically. One little girl wrapped her arms around Naomi before hurrying toward her teacher with a bright smile. Gabriel slowly continued walking toward his office, but he no longer remembered the financial report he had intended to review. Instead, one quiet thought remained with him throughout the evening. For the first time since Naomi had arrived at the estate, he realized he had overlooked someone whose greatest strength was never asking to be seen. From that afternoon forward, Gabriel Bennett began noticing details he had somehow overlooked for months. Not because Naomi Brooks tried to stand out, but because genuine character has a quiet way of making itself impossible to ignore once it has finally been seen. The Bennett estate continued operating with its usual precision, yet Gabriel found himself paying closer attention to the people who kept that precision alive. During morning walks through the mansion before leaving for meetings, he noticed employees greeting Naomi with sincere smiles instead of routine politeness. The elderly gardener whose aching knees often slowed him down now finished his work with fresh determination because Naomi regularly arrived a few minutes early to help move heavy supplies before anyone else appeared. The kitchen staff laughed more often during busy afternoons because she always found a gentle way to ease growing tension without distracting anyone from their responsibilities. Even Mrs. Eleanor Hayes, known for maintaining strict professional standards, quietly admitted to herself that the atmosphere throughout the estate had become noticeably warmer since Naomi's arrival. Gabriel never mentioned his observations aloud. He simply watched. One rainy evening, he returned unexpectedly from a canceled business dinner and entered the mansion through the side entrance rather than the grand front doors. As he passed the staff dining room, he noticed the lights were still on long after most employees had finished their shifts. Curious, he paused outside the partially opened doorway. Inside, Naomi sat beside Thomas, one of the youngest maintenance workers on the estate. The young man stared silently at several community college application forms spread across the table. His shoulders slumped with discouragement as he quietly admitted that he had nearly abandoned his dream of studying engineering because he believed he could never afford tuition. Naomi listened without interrupting. She did not promise miracles or easy solutions. Instead, she helped him organize deadlines, locate scholarship opportunities, and prepare a realistic plan that could be completed one step at a time. She reminded him that progress often belonged to those who continued walking even when the destination remained invisible. Thomas slowly smiled for the first time that evening. Gabriel quietly stepped away before either of them realized he had been there. That conversation remained with him long after he reached his office. Naomi never acted differently when influential guests were present than when no one appeared to be watching. Every act of kindness seemed entirely genuine. Weeks passed, and invitations for the annual Bennett Foundation Gala began arriving throughout the city. The event would gather prominent business leaders, politicians, philanthropists, and members of several respected families, including Victoria Langford and her father, Richard Langford. Preparations transformed the estate into a masterpiece of elegance. Fresh white roses lined the grand staircase, crystal chandeliers sparkled above polished marble floors, and every member of the household worked tirelessly to create a flawless evening. Naomi devoted herself to every detail with the same quiet professionalism she brought to ordinary days. During one afternoon rehearsal, Victoria arrived earlier than expected. While walking through the ballroom with her father, she paused as she noticed Gabriel thanking Naomi for helping organize the children's charity donations scheduled for the following morning. It was a brief exchange lasting only seconds, yet Gabriel's respectful tone caught Victoria's attention immediately. Richard noticed it as well. Neither of them spoke while they continued their tour of the estate, but thoughtful silence replaced casual conversation. Later that evening, after returning home, Richard quietly asked his daughter a question that lingered in both their minds. "Have you noticed," he said carefully, "how often Gabriel seems to value the opinion of one particular employee?" Victoria looked out the window without answering. Somewhere inside the Bennett estate, Naomi finished arranging the final centerpiece before switching off the ballroom lights, completely unaware that the first whispers capable of changing all their lives had already begun. The days leading to the Bennett Foundation Gala grew increasingly busy, yet beneath the polished routines and elegant preparations, something invisible had begun to change. Conversations that once centered on guest lists, floral arrangements, and charitable donations slowly shifted toward quieter subjects spoken only after doors had closed. Naomi Brooks noticed the difference long before anyone mentioned it directly to her. Friendly greetings became shorter. A few conversations stopped the moment she entered a room. Employees who had always treated her warmly now glanced around before speaking, as though they feared someone else might misunderstand ordinary kindness. Naomi never confronted anyone. She simply continued working with the same quiet grace that had always defined her. One afternoon, while replacing fresh flowers inside the west hallway, she accidentally overheard two visiting event coordinators speaking just beyond the library doors. They did not know she was nearby. One quietly remarked that influential families often disliked seeing household employees receive too much attention because appearances carried enormous weight in their social circles. The other replied that rumors rarely needed facts to become dangerous. Naomi stood perfectly still for a moment before quietly walking away without allowing either person to realize she had heard them. That evening she completed every remaining task with the same calm professionalism, yet something inside her had changed. For the first time since arriving at the estate, she wondered whether her presence had unintentionally become a burden for the very people who had given her an opportunity. Meanwhile, Gabriel remained occupied with meetings surrounding the upcoming gala and the engagement announcement that every guest expected to witness. Richard Langford called several times to discuss final arrangements, while Victoria remained polite and composed during each conversation. Neither mentioned Naomi directly, yet Gabriel sensed an unusual hesitation beneath their otherwise courteous words. He dismissed it as ordinary stress surrounding such an important event. He had no idea that whispers had already traveled far beyond his own household. Late that night, after nearly every light inside the mansion had been switched off, Naomi returned to her modest room located above the staff quarters. Rain tapped gently against the window as she removed her name badge and carefully folded her uniform for the following morning. She sat quietly at the small wooden desk near the window, staring at a blank sheet of stationery for several minutes before finally picking up a pen. Every sentence came slowly. She thanked Gabriel Bennett for offering her honest employment and a respectful workplace. She expressed gratitude toward Mrs. Eleanor Hayes and every employee who had shown her kindness. She apologized if her presence had ever created unnecessary difficulties for the estate or distracted attention from its charitable mission. Finally, she wrote that she believed leaving quietly would be the best way to protect the peace of everyone involved. There were no accusations, no bitterness, no attempt to defend herself, only gratitude and a sincere hope that the Bennett household would continue helping others long after she was gone. She folded the letter carefully, placed it inside an envelope, and wrote Gabriel Bennett's name across the front in neat handwriting. The following morning, before sunrise colored the horizon, Naomi quietly slipped the envelope beneath the office door and returned to her duties as though nothing had happened. Several hours later, Gabriel entered his office between meetings. While reviewing contracts stacked neatly across his desk, he noticed the unfamiliar envelope waiting on the polished wood floor. Assuming it contained routine paperwork, he opened it without hesitation. As his eyes moved across Naomi's carefully written words, the room around him seemed strangely silent. Every sentence reflected humility instead of resentment. Every line thanked people who had unknowingly become the reason she believed she had to leave. When he reached the final page, Gabriel slowly lowered the letter and remained motionless for several long moments. For the first time in many years, a successful businessman who believed he noticed everything realized he had completely failed to see the quiet cost another person had been carrying alone. By the time the evening of the Bennett Foundation Gala finally arrived, the mansion glowed like a palace beneath thousands of warm lights. Luxury vehicles filled the circular driveway as distinguished guests stepped onto the marble entrance one after another. Business leaders, judges, philanthropists, elected officials, and respected families exchanged polished greetings while photographers quietly documented the elegant celebration. Every detail reflected months of preparation. Crystal chandeliers shimmered above the grand ballroom. Fresh white roses lined the staircase, and a string quartet filled the air with gentle classical music. Naomi Brooks moved gracefully among the serving staff with the same quiet professionalism she had shown since her first day at the estate. Although the resignation letter rested safely inside Gabriel Bennett's private office, no one besides him knew it existed. She had already decided that tonight would be her final evening inside the mansion she had come to think of as home. Gabriel welcomed each arriving guest with calm confidence, yet his thoughts repeatedly returned to the handwritten letter folded inside the inner pocket of his jacket. Every polite conversation became background noise. Every congratulation regarding his expected engagement sounded strangely distant. He could still remember every sentence Naomi had written, especially the line explaining that peace sometimes required personal sacrifice. Instead of feeling grateful for her loyalty, he felt the growing weight of realizing that someone so kind believed leaving was the only way to protect the people around her. Victoria Langford arrived shortly before the formal announcement wearing an elegant ivory evening gown. She greeted Gabriel warmly, though a quiet sadness lingered behind her composed smile. Richard Langford followed beside her with the confident posture of a man accustomed to shaping important decisions. As guests gradually gathered around the ceremonial table prepared for the evening's announcement, conversations softened into respectful silence. Mrs. Eleanor Hayes discreetly directed the household staff into their assigned positions, while Naomi took her place near the back of the ballroom, holding a polished silver serving tray. She deliberately chose the least noticeable position in the room, hoping the evening would pass peacefully without drawing attention to herself. Gabriel glanced toward her only once before facing the assembled guests. Richard stepped forward first, thanking everyone for supporting both families throughout the years. He spoke about legacy, stability, responsibility, and the importance of preserving traditions that had guided respected households for generations. His speech received warm applause. Then his voice became more deliberate. He acknowledged that recent conversations had created uncertainty among certain guests and business partners. Although he never mentioned Naomi by name, nearly every person in the ballroom instinctively turned toward the quiet maid standing at the rear of the room. Victoria lowered her eyes for a brief moment before looking back at Gabriel with genuine concern. Richard allowed the silence to settle before taking one measured step closer. Every leader eventually faces a decision that defines not only his future, but the future of everyone connected to him, he said calmly. Some choices cannot be postponed. He looked directly into Gabriel's eyes. Tonight, before these witnesses, I ask for clarity. The room became completely still. Even the musicians lowered their instruments. Richard slowly raised one hand toward Victoria before extending the other toward the far end of the ballroom, where Naomi stood frozen in quiet disbelief. His voice remained calm, almost gentle, making the words feel even heavier. Choose one, he said. Choose the woman who belongs beside your future, or choose the woman whose presence has already changed it. Every eye fixed upon Gabriel. Naomi quietly lowered her gaze, believing her resignation letter had already answered the question for him. Gabriel reached slowly inside his jacket. Many assumed he was preparing to remove the engagement papers waiting to be signed. Instead, his fingers closed around the folded letter Naomi had written, and without saying a single word, he stepped away from the ceremonial table and began walking directly toward her. Gabriel Bennett crossed the polished marble floor without the slightest hesitation, each measured step echoing through the silent ballroom. Hundreds of distinguished guests watched him leave the ceremonial table where the engagement documents waited untouched. Naomi Brooks lowered her eyes, convinced he intended to quietly return her resignation letter before asking her to leave with dignity. Instead, Gabriel stopped directly in front of her. Neither of them spoke for several long seconds. The only sound came from the soft crackling of candlelight and the distant fountain beyond the open terrace. Gabriel looked down at the folded envelope in his hand before slowly lifting it between them. "You wrote that peace sometimes requires personal sacrifice," he said quietly. Naomi nodded almost imperceptibly. "I believed leaving was the kindest choice," she answered softly. "I never wanted my presence to become a burden for anyone." Gabriel studied her calm expression, realizing that even now she showed more concern for others than for herself. Without another word, he unfolded the letter one final time, glanced briefly across the familiar handwriting, and then slowly tore the pages into several pieces. The faint sound of paper separating seemed impossibly loud inside the motionless ballroom. Naomi looked up in complete surprise. Mrs. Eleanor Hayes quietly covered her mouth. Victoria closed her eyes for a brief moment, understanding exactly what that simple gesture meant before anyone else did. Richard Langford's composed expression hardened, though he remained perfectly still. Gabriel allowed the torn pieces of paper to fall gently into a nearby silver tray before turning back toward the assembled guests. His voice remained calm, steady, and entirely free of anger. "This letter should never have been written," he said, "because no decent person should ever feel obligated to disappear simply to make others comfortable." No one interrupted him. "For months, I believed I understood leadership," Gabriel continued. "I believed it meant protecting reputation, preserving influence, and making decisions that satisfied expectations. Then I discovered someone inside my own home who quietly reminded me what leadership actually demands." He looked briefly toward Naomi before facing the room once again. "Leadership begins by recognizing the value of people who expect nothing in return." Several guests lowered their eyes. Others remained frozen where they stood. Richard finally stepped forward. "Gabriel," he said carefully, "this is larger than personal admiration. Families, partnerships, and generations depend upon wise decisions. Do not confuse compassion with responsibility." Gabriel met his gaze without hostility. "I am not confusing them," he replied. "For the first time, I believe I am finally separating them." He slowly walked back toward the ceremonial table where the engagement documents remained perfectly arranged. Every camera in the ballroom followed him. Victoria stood quietly waiting, her expression dignified despite the sadness reflected in her eyes. Gabriel gently closed the leather folder without signing a single page. He lifted it carefully and placed it into Victoria's hands. "You deserve someone whose heart is fully committed to the future you dream of," he said with complete sincerity. "Offering you anything less would be deeply unfair." Victoria looked at him for several silent moments before accepting the folder with quiet grace. Although disappointment touched her face, there was no bitterness in her eyes. She understood that honesty delivered at the hardest moment remained more honorable than a lifetime built upon pretense. Richard slowly released a long breath. Around the ballroom, several influential guests exchanged uncertain glances while others quietly stepped away from the celebration, believing they had just witnessed the collapse of an extraordinary alliance. Yet many remained exactly where they were, unable to leave after hearing words that challenged everything they believed about status and worth. Gabriel returned to Naomi's side, not with dramatic gestures or declarations, but with calm respect. Looking directly at the assembled guests, he spoke one final sentence that settled over the ballroom like complete silence. "If choosing dignity over appearance costs me influence," he said, "then influence was never worth protecting in the first place." For several endless seconds, no one moved. The grand ballroom, filled only moments earlier with confident conversations and polished laughter, became so quiet that the faint melody from the string quartet faded into complete silence. Gabriel Bennett remained standing beside Naomi Brooks, his posture relaxed, his expression unchanged, as though he had simply spoken an obvious truth instead of altering the expectations of every influential person in the room. Richard Langford slowly lowered his gaze before looking once more toward Gabriel. Years of experience had taught him that some decisions could still be negotiated, but he immediately recognized that this was no longer one of them. Without anger or raised voices, he turned toward his daughter. Victoria held the leather folder against her side for a brief moment before offering Gabriel a small, sincere smile. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Not because this is easy, but because honesty is kinder than promises that cannot be kept." Gabriel inclined his head. Respectfully, "You deserve a life built on truth," he answered. "I sincerely hope you find every happiness." Victoria nodded once before leaving the ballroom beside her father. Several guests followed them toward the entrance, convinced they had just watched one of the most unexpected endings in the city's social history. Others remained where they stood, unable to explain why leaving suddenly felt more difficult than staying. Mrs. Eleanor Hayes slowly stepped forward from among the household staff. For years she had supervised hundreds of employees with fairness and discipline, yet tears quietly filled her eyes as she looked toward Naomi. She realized that the young woman who had entered the estate carrying 2 modest suitcases had never asked for recognition, influence, or admiration. She had simply chosen kindness every single day until kindness became impossible to overlook. One by one, members of the household staff instinctively gathered nearby. Thomas, the young maintenance worker Naomi had encouraged to continue pursuing college, stood proudly beside the elderly gardener she had helped every morning. The kitchen assistants smiled through their emotions. None of them applauded. The moment felt too meaningful for celebration. It deserved only respectful silence. Gabriel looked across the remaining guests before speaking again. "Tonight was never meant to become a lesson," he said calmly. "But perhaps we all needed one." His voice remained gentle. "Every person inside this home contributes something that cannot be measured by titles, wealth, or social standing. If someone believes dignity belongs only to those with influence, then that person has misunderstood dignity completely." Several respected business leaders slowly exchanged thoughtful glances. An elderly federal judge quietly removed his glasses before saying, almost to himself, "Character reveals itself when reputation is no longer the highest priority." Nearby, the director of a charitable foundation nodded in quiet agreement. The atmosphere that had begun with tension gradually transformed into thoughtful reflection. Naomi remained almost speechless. She had spent months believing that leaving quietly would protect everyone around her. She never imagined someone as powerful as Gabriel would publicly defend the very dignity she had been prepared to surrender. Looking at him, she spoke softly enough that only he could hear. "You did not have to do this." Gabriel answered with the same calm sincerity that had guided every decision that evening. "No," he replied. "I should have done it much sooner." Outside, the first light rain began falling across the estate gardens, washing the marble pathways with shimmering reflections beneath the evening lights. Inside, the ballroom no longer felt like a place where reputations had been lost. It felt like a place where truth had finally become more valuable than appearances. And for the first time since arriving at the Bennett estate, Naomi no longer stood in the room as someone merely serving the evening. She stood there as a woman whose quiet dignity had changed the hearts of everyone willing to see it. Several months passed, and the Bennett estate no longer felt like the place Naomi Brooks had first entered carrying 2 modest suitcases. The marble floors still reflected the morning sunlight. The gardens remained perfectly maintained, and distinguished guests continued arriving for charitable events throughout the year, yet the atmosphere had changed in a way that no architect could have designed. Employees smiled more freely. Conversations sounded warmer. New members of the household quickly discovered that respect flowed naturally from the top, instead of stopping at titles or positions. Gabriel Bennett had quietly transformed the culture of his home without announcing a single grand reform. Instead of issuing speeches, he changed everyday decisions. Managers were encouraged to recognize hidden talent rather than simply reward seniority. Every employee received opportunities for professional development regardless of position. Suggestions from every department were welcomed during monthly meetings. The estate slowly became known not only for its elegance, but for the uncommon dignity with which every person was treated. One peaceful afternoon, Gabriel invited Naomi to meet him inside the old library where, months earlier, she had read stories to children gathered around the fireplace. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating shelves filled with generations of family history. Naomi entered quietly, still wearing her immaculate Black Maid uniform, expecting another routine assignment. Instead, Gabriel placed a simple folder on the wooden table between them. She opened it carefully. Inside was an official employment agreement creating an entirely new position within the Bennett Foundation. The role would oversee employee development, educational opportunities, community outreach, and volunteer programs across every Bennett property. Naomi looked at the pages in disbelief before raising her eyes toward Gabriel. "I do not have the experience for this," she said honestly. Gabriel smiled gently, the smallest expression Naomi had ever seen on his normally composed face. "Experience can be learned," he replied. "Character cannot. You have already been doing this work every day without the title." Naomi lowered her eyes as quiet emotion filled them. For the first time in her life, someone had recognized not only the work she performed, but the person she had always tried to become. She accepted the folder with both hands, not because it represented success, but because it represented trust. News of the changes within the Bennett Foundation gradually spread beyond the estate. Other organizations began asking how employee morale had improved so dramatically. Several charitable groups partnered with the foundation to create scholarship programs for working families, leadership workshops for household employees, and community reading events inspired by the afternoon Naomi had once spent with a room full of children. What began as one quiet act of kindness continued touching lives far beyond the mansion walls. Victoria Langford also found peace with time. Nearly a year after the gala, she sent Gabriel a handwritten letter wishing both him and Naomi happiness and thanking them for choosing honesty instead of convenience. Gabriel placed the letter inside his desk beside several family photographs, grateful that respect had remained even after difficult decisions. Early one spring morning, Gabriel walked alone through the estate gardens. White roses bloomed beside the stone pathways while birds welcomed the new day from the old oak trees. In the distance, Naomi stood with several newly hired employees, patiently introducing them to their responsibilities. She spoke with the same gentle voice she had always possessed, encouraging each person to ask questions, reminding them that every role inside the estate mattered. Gabriel stopped for only a moment, watching quietly from afar. He did not interrupt. He did not seek recognition. He simply smiled with quiet satisfaction before continuing his walk beneath the morning sunlight. There was nothing left to prove. The mansion no longer remembered Naomi as the quiet maid who once tried to leave unnoticed. It remembered her as the woman whose unwavering dignity quietly transformed an entire household. And on that peaceful morning, everyone who called the Bennett estate home understood that the strongest legacy any leader could leave behind was never built through wealth, influence, or power alone, but through the courage to recognize another person's worth long before the rest of the world was willing to see it.